Hello, and welcome to Tales from a Sex Store. My name's Hazel, and today I'm here with my guest host, Cole. Hi, Cole.
Hi,
Hi. How are you?
I'm good.
Excellent.
I'm great. I closed the store last night and woke up early this morning to record this podcast.
The things that we do for the things that we do.
Uh-huh.
I guess it's love, right? It's all
Yes.
about love. Everything's about
Yes.
love. And if it's not, it should be. So you wanted to come back on and elaborate on Stonewall because you had just sort of briefly mentioned, oh, I should have prepared for this while
Mm-hmm.
we were touching on it in relationship to the brick keychain. So here we are. Tell us your things about Stonewall.
Yes. So elaborating a little bit on Stonewall, and then we'll get into some other aspects of queer history as well that relate a little bit more to the store, like the Hanky Code and cruising culture.
Oh, cool.
I wanted to start with a little note on the evolution of language because as we're talking about Stonewall, you might notice some of the language that people used to describe themselves at the time in the 1960s and 70s is not the language that we use today very often, and sometimes it's even considered like offensive language today.
Oh,
But
sure.
I personally believe that, we should be honoring these people with the language that they use to describe themselves and not retrospectively applying our language of today onto them and how they identified.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, just a little note on language.
Especially since you and I specifically didn't know them firsthand. I think that
Yes.
maybe a caveat could be made if you knew a person in their
Yes.
life and their
Yeah.
personal desires and then gave them as a gift a more
Mhm.
modern language. As language evolves, it gets more specific. I'm speaking personally right now.
Yeah.
I had a great aunt, and everything about her life indicated that she was a trans man in a time where there was no such language for that. And it feels like a gift. Having known her for my whole life, she passed away about 2 years ago at the age of 96. But I agree with you that as a society, we shouldn't retroactively attach modern language to people without having known them.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's an important caveat. Thank you.
I'm glad you agree because I was
Yeah.
spitballing as out of the emotions, not out of deep academic consideration.
Yeah, yeah, because I don't know these people that I'm going to talk about. I wanna identify them with the language that they use to describe themselves
Of course.
rather than retroactively. I think I said retrospectively, you know.
Sure.
Words hard at early hours of the morning. Retroactively applying language to them that they didn't use to describe themselves.
Of course. I appreciate you honoring that.
I appreciate being able to come back on to elaborate a little bit further on some of the stuff that we talked about last week.
Cool beans.
Yeah.
Well, hit us. Hit us with your best
Yeah, let's
shot.
get into it. So, wanted to start by kind of elaborating on some of the things that I had mentioned last week. I think
Mm.
last week I had referred to Stonewall as a gay bar. And while that was maybe more accurate to the language at the time, I realized after recording that I don't think that it quite illustrated the diversity of the people who frequented Stonewall. I think today when we think of gay bar, we think of gay male spaces, and Stonewall was really a space that everyone in the LGBTQ community would gather.
So, from our perspective, in this language, in this day, we would probably refer to it as a queer bar.
Yeah, probably.
But
Yeah.
using their language of the time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Snapshot of history.
Yeah. Which is just really interesting how language things like that can change. And because of that, we can use language that was accurate to the time, but the way that it might be interpreted now might not lead to an accurate interpretation,
Yeah.
which I think is just really interesting. There's also been, we talked a little bit about the mythology of the brick last week, but there's also been several different people who were credited with throwing the first brick, and I put that in air quotes, which the listeners can't see.
I love that you always say that, though. You make little gesticulations, and then you're like, nobody can see that I'm doing this, but it's important."
Nobody nobody could see, but I put brick in, air quotes because accounts of, what was thrown. Was it a brick? Maybe it was a shot glass, or maybe it was a punch. Everyone kinda has,
Sure. The important thing is
Yeah,
the symbolism.
yeah. Yeah, which is where we get, like, that symbolism of the brick, but there's been a few different people credited with throwing the first brick, so to say. One of those people was Marsha P. Johnson, which we didn't get a chance to talk about last week, and she's often credited as the Black trans woman who started Pride or started the gay liberation movement. But in her lifetime, the language that we know that she identified herself with was as a gay person, as a transvestite, and as a drag queen.
Slay.
Slay. Yes. And there's some conflicting accounts on whether she was there at the beginning of the Stonewall riot, which is part of where that, conflicting account of who threw the first brick. But we do know that she was there for, a pretty significant portion of the riots, which is not to like discount, like, just because she may not have been the person to throw the first brick. That's not to discount any of the work that she did in her lifetime. She did a lot of really great work with her friend Sylvia Rivera. They co-founded STAR, or the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which provided housing, clothing, and food to homeless LGBTQ plus youth.
That's
So
amazing.
certainly not to like discount any of the work that she did just because there's conflicting information on, whether or not she threw the first brick. Alternatively, one of the other people who is credited with potentially throwing the first brick or punch or, whatever was thrown
Right.
is Storm DeLarvier. I have my pronunciation written down, so hopefully I got that correct. And they are credited with potentially throwing the first punch. And we don't have a ton of information on how they personally identified in their lifetime, but they're often remembered as a like drag king or butch lesbian.
Awesome.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting because I was running some of my notes for the podcast by one of our coworkers, Marrakesh, who's been on the podcast before.
Mhm. They're awesome.
They're awesome, they're amazing, and I was telling them about Storm DeLarvier, and they were like, "Oh, I don't know if I've heard of them." And I'm like, "That's just, like, that's so interesting to me." And I think I had, like, heard of them maybe, but I really only came across them in doing research for the podcast today. I maybe had heard about them in, like, one of my LGBTQ studies classes, but, it's not a big name that I feel like comes up often when talking about Stonewall or queer history, so I wanted to include it today. I just
Totally.
think that's really interesting how, like, when we're talking about history, we all learned different things, and a lot of us didn't learn a lot of queer history in our, like, K through 12 schooling, if any at all.
Right, right. Well, and this is the problem with not having a unified queer history book or something like that. Nobody knows everything about queer history because it has, throughout history, or at least throughout modern history, been largely shoved under the carpet or erased. Just recently, there were some dramatic edits that were made by the government to the Stonewall website. So, what can we know? It's just knowing the history is an act of rebellion, which is amazing. But also,
Yeah.
it means that it's a hodgepodge of information that we all hold, and together we can recreate it from our stories. But again, it comes back to just being stories at a certain point.
Yeah, and I that's why we get so many conflicting accounts of what really happened, because while there was an effort to really remember Stonewall, a year later, a year after Stonewall was, the first Pride March organized by the newly founded Gay Liberation Front. but we still do have those conflicting reports of who did throw the first brick. How long exactly did Stonewall go on for? We know vaguely that it went from, the early hours of June 28th to July 3rd,
That's so
but
long
yeah, it's pretty long, but a lot of history sometimes just gets lost to time, especially when there's not
when it's actively being repressed.
especially when it's just like, yeah, actively being repressed. That is kind of, a lot of the notes that I have on Stonewall for today.
Sure. Right, and so, Cole, you were talking about the Hanky Code, and you were talking about iconography, right?
Yes.
So tell us, why do you know about the Hanky Code?
Yes. So I thought that the Hanky Code would be a really interesting thing to touch on today, especially because we got some hankies in. And so as I've been working at the store recently, people are just like, why do you sell bandanas?
Right,
And so and that's a question that's come up a lot recently. And so I've been talking a lot about the Hanky Code at the store.
right.
So yeah, just kind of wanted to elaborate on the podcast as well.
Sure, and real fast, so the reason that you can speak to this specifically is because of what you're studying at university, right?
Yeah, I'm studying my majors in human development, family studies, but I have minors that I'm studying in women's gender and sexuality studies as well as sociology. And I have a specific interest in symbolic interactionist theory, which put very simply is the study of the meaning that we put to symbols.
Awesome, and I think you told me, and maybe I got this wrong, but before we started recording, that you've actually done a presentation on hankies before, right?
I have. I did a broader presentation on queer semiotics and queer symbolism.
That's cool. What is semiotics?
So semiotics is the study of symbols and the meaning that we assign to
Oh,
them.
so
It's
literally
kind of
just what you
the
were
it's
saying. Got
yeah,
it.
it's kind of just the big fancy word for symbolic interactionist theory,
Oh,
the
that's
like
cool.
big broader term. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I love words. Thank you for explaining that to me.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I've done a presentation before for the Queer Straight Alliance when I was part of their leadership team. I've done a presentation on queer symbols before.
Mm,
And part of that was presenting on, the Hanky Code. And so I took some of my research and literature review that I did for that, and I've expanded on it here for the podcast today.
awesome. Sweet. I'm
Yes.
excited.
So,
I know that the hanky code is like it's literally like dozens of colors
yes.
at its like most elaborate and linguistic fluency for the color coding.
Yes.
So like how many hankies are we carrying at the store?
I don't remember an exact number off the top of my head. We certainly don't carry, like, the full range of colors at the store. We carry, what we have available to us, which are some of the,
Roy G. Biv.
The Roy G. Biv colors is a lot of what we have at the store right now. Roy G. Biv plus black is
Nice.
pretty much what we have, and we have a few of the shades of blue. Yes, we have a few shades of blue. The origins of the Hanky Code, for those who don't know, it originated in the early 1970s in gay leather and BDSM scenes. Very, very brief history of leather. I think this is something that would be a really interesting podcast episode later on with someone who is actually part of the leather subculture who can, like, speak to it a little bit better than I can. But the leather subculture started post World War II, and one thing that I wanna highlight for folks on the podcast is that the leather subculture does go beyond just sex and kink and does uphold values such as chosen family and mentorship, as well as, like, the art of the craft and the care of leather.
Oh my gosh,
Uh,
totally. Most people
yeah.
abuse their leather clothing so badly. I am guilty of this. I had a leather jacket once, and did I get side-eyed when that was seen by people who were in the leather community. It was
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of care that goes into leather. I took a really interesting boot blacking class at KinkCon last year with
mm,
Ojai with
cool.
the current international Mr. Leather. I think maybe there's a new one now. I'm not fully caught up on, when those competitions happen. but it was the 2025 International Mr. Leather, and I was able to take a boot blacking class with him, and it
Cool.
was absolutely amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and it was super cool for that to be, like, an event that was happening up in Montana as well.
I mean, Montana and leather, that just, like, sounds like it goes together.
Yeah, you would think, but I find that our genuine leather, real leather products don't sell as well for us at
Well,
the
that's
store, but
yeah. There's
yeah.
a lot that goes into that, though, you know?
Yeah,
Consumer consciousness
yeah.
as well as price.
Yes, yes, leather is pretty pricey most of the time.
But if anybody is looking for leather work, there are some leather smiths in Bozeman that are really fantastic, and will do custom work.
Yes. Yeah.
So, Cole, what is the Hanky Code?
Yeah, so the hanky code was done by wearing a colored handkerchief in the back pocket, either the left pocket or the right pocket. The left pocket traditionally signals someone in a role, more giving or like more dominant role in
Okay,
a sexual situation, or the right pocket for a more like bottom or receiving role in a sexual situation.
cool.
But yeah, it was also referred to as flagging, and it would be done while in queer spaces while cruising. Do you wanna define cruising?
So my understanding of cruising is it's basically when you're out to get laid. It's like
Yes. Yeah,
basically
essentially. Yeah, out
everybody
out and about
cruises, you know?
to do, like, pick up sex to get laid.
Everybody cruises, you know, it's the same thing as,
Yeah.
like, just going to the bar, right? You go to
Yeah.
the bar and you try and hook up. That's cruising.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just we call it by a different name in the queer community, cruising, or especially in, like, the Hanky Code, the
Yeah.
flagging code community. It's like pre-dating app communications of your interests and
Yeah.
position in those interests.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so and the Hanky Code was largely a response to laws criminalizing queer sex that were around at the time,
Right.
and due to these laws, cruising often happened in, like, parks or subway stations or other areas that weren't heavily surveillanced by law enforcement.
I cannot imagine a subway station that isn't heavily surveilled.
I know, but that was what was coming up in my research with subway stations, and I was like, "I feel like there would've been law enforcement
That's interesting.
in subway stations," but
Wait, is this, like, historically?
historically, yes.
Okay. I was gonna say maybe
Yeah,
subways didn't have surveillance back in the day, and it was just, like, an easy place to access, like, a free
yeah,
public bathroom or something.
yeah.
But nowadays, I can't imagine
But
it.
yeah, now yeah. Which I think it's also interesting, I had sent in our Slack earlier this week, Miss Kitty's, the old style sex store that used to exist in Eratik's location.
Yeah.
I had been told a few years ago by a friend that it was a old cruising spot
Oh,
and that
that
it was
checks out.
actually listed in Bob Dameron's address book, which is a gay travel guide that ran from, I wanna say, the 1960s to the early 2000s.
That's awesome. Oh my god, that's
Yeah.
fantastic.
And it
Cool.
listed Miss Kitty's not as a cruising spot, but as, like, an erotica location,
Oh, sure, sure.
but
I'm always a little
yeah.
surprised. You know, I when I grew up in Montana, I started in Big Timber. I started.
Mhm.
First memories were Big Timber, and then I moved to Bozeman when I was 5, and it was like, I'm always surprised when any other place in the world or anything that is nationally known has any idea that Montana is even there. Like let alone showing up in a nationally known or maybe internationally even known reference guide as having a location is just surprising to me, but it's really cool. Good for us.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Miss Kitty's used to be listed. Yeah, super cool. But how did you know when you were cruising if someone else was also cruising or even looking for the same type of sex as you? That
Right.
is where the hanky code came in. So I think it's important to note that there's a few, like we were talking about with Stonewall, with a few different accounts of how exactly things happened.
Mm.
There's a few different versions of hanky code that could be geographically dependent.
Oh, sure. So, like, linguistically, that would be like dialect, right?
Yeah,
Like a Southern drawl versus Brooklyn accent type of situation.
yeah,
Cool. That's
yeah,
fun that that came across in the Hanky
yeah,
Code. I love
yeah.
that.
But some common colors that were a little bit more universal, at least what I found in my research, was red was often used to indicate an interest in fisting. Navy blue had a couple different listings. Sometimes it was listed as just sex, and sometimes it was listed more specifically as anal sex.
Mm.
Yellow being water sports, or for those who don't know, piss play. And black was sometimes used to represent S&M or sometimes more specifically like heavier S&M.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So those are a few like common colors, but I guess gray, which indicates an interest in bondage, is one that I see common locally, which I think is because we have a huge bondage and like rope community here.
So, gray as opposed to black.
Yes.
Bondage as
Yeah.
opposed to heavier BDSM.
As opposed to like sadism and masochism. Yeah.
Ha 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 ha. 'Kay.
Yeah. The code has also, expanded quite a bit, especially with the invention of the internet, to include not just like the color of your hanky, but the type of fabric that you had in your
What?
back pocket.
That is
Yeah.
so nuanced. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
So, a couple examples of this would be white velvet, indicating that someone might be a voyeur or an exhibitionist, depending on what pocket it was in, or even brown lace to indicate someone who's uncircumcised or looking for someone who's uncircumcised.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is so specific and fascinating. Brown lace and
Yeah.
white velvet.
Yeah. It's always been interesting to me because I feel like there's also, like different shades of blue mean different things.
Yeah,
And I've always imagined that that would be hard to distinguish in a lot of locations where cruising is like
totally, yeah.
common
If you're at a club or whatever and you've got, like,
at a
crazy
club
lighting.
or a bar that doesn't like has crazy lighting or just like very dim lighting.
Mm,
I imagine that, these nuances would be hard to pick up on. So I've always been impressed by people who can just like pick up on the like slight nuances of,
right.
yeah,
Identify the differences
different.
between shades of blue.
Yeah.
I could just imagine the people are turning on their cell phone light really fast and then turning it back off again, just boop, boop. I know what
Yeah.
shade that is now.
Yeah. One of the things that I also thought was interesting and that I wanted to research was how did people like learn a code that was so nuanced in the first place? And what I found was that often the code was learned through like word of mouth, telling your friends, like, oh, here's the code.
Mm,
Or there was also little, like, pocket guides or wallet-sized guides that were distributed by gay bars, leather shops, and adult bookstores, so they would distribute the
that's
code
cool.
and what it meant, which I thought was interesting because one of the brands, Bird Beaks, that we brought in for our hankies in the store actually come with a little pocket guide to
That's
Hanky
good.
Code.
I was just gonna
Yeah,
ask if we had one because that it
yeah,
seems like we should. That's good.
yeah. Yeah. We have one and we have one hanging up in the store as well, right by where we sell
Perfect.
the hankies. So, another thing that I found interesting, a lot of times we associate the hanky code with gay male spaces,
Mm,
but Samwa, which was a lesbian feminist BDSM organization based out of, I believe, San Francisco, but don't quote me on that.
and what was it called?
Samwa.
Samwa.
Yeah, it was
Cool.
spelled Samois.
All one
But
word.
the pronunciation yes.
Cool, okay.
But the pronunciation I was finding was Samoa. Yes. Developed or distributed a lesbian version of the code, which had some unique colors, including maroon for likes menstruating women or is currently menstruating, which I thought was super interesting.
Cool. Love that.
Yeah. And I do think it's important to note that Hanky Code is still, used today.
Yeah, it's alive and well. It is a living language.
Yeah. One of the interesting ways that I found that it's used today is through the gay cruising app Muscle allows you to add your hankies to your profile, which I think is
Oh,
super interesting.
nice. And, I mean, just having a color coding like that accessible, you could use that on any app really just by throwing up that color of, say, heart in your profile.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting how cruising culture has evolved over time, especially with sodomy laws no longer being in place. It allows for people to be more open. So while it is still a little bit of a the secret language of cruising and the body language of cruising, information is a little bit more out in the open about how to cruise and cruising etiquette and things like that.
Cool. That's good.
Yeah, and with cruising culture today moving largely to the digital world, I think it is important to note that the Hanky Code is still alive and well today, and so are like in-person cruising cultures. And some may even criticize it's reducing the in-person cruising culture and reducing that face-to-face interaction that comes along with sex and cruising.
Totally. I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Like when it comes to dating apps, especially ones that are sort of angled towards quick hookups as opposed to building relationships, it's definitely going to be a different environment. And how do you build a kind of cultural language or a community without any kind of deeper connection? And it all comes down to this one act. It's just empty. There's no relationship there. And building a relationship when people are mostly looking for hookups, yeah, it's hard. And so I can see why in person hinky or flagging culture is still alive and well. You might be looking for a human connection. You might be looking for more than just sex. And even if it is just sex, at least it's sex with a person and not the equivalent of having a meal delivered. It's hollow. It feels hollow. It just feels hollow.
Yeah, I think that's a common critique, and obviously different apps have different cultures around them,
Sure.
which I know is also, like, somewhat geographical, so I know that there's apps that, for example, in Bozeman are more oriented to hookups, but maybe, somewhere else, people have luck with finding and building relationships on those apps.
Yeah,
And, each app has its own kind of, like, culture around it, which is, like, super
totally.
interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is like a common critique I hear, not just of like cruising culture, but like modern dating culture in general is that it's tricky when some people are on the app just for a one night stand and some people are on the app and building their profiles, like looking for something more long term.
Right, exactly. And it's exhausting to build a really relationship-oriented profile on a dating app and then get feedback from all of these potential matches that give you a moment of hope, and then they're just, "Hey," and that's it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
people looking for the thrill of reaching out and making a quick connection without any need to emotionally engage,
Yeah. I had to personally delete all my dating app profiles probably about like 6 months ago because I was just like, I just can't
right?
engage with this right now.
Yeah, it's
Like,
heavy,
I'm going onto it for, like, not the healthiest reasons, for the quick thrill of messaging someone and then, you know
right, and that it doesn't feel good for anybody. It doesn't feel
Yeah,
good to do, and it doesn't feel good to have it done, you know?
for the dopamine hit of feeling desired because I got a match.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, I feel like dating apps really do they're difficult. They're problematic.
They are, and I think it's hard, especially I can only speak from my experience being in Bozeman, so I don't know how that differs in a bigger city like where you are in San Francisco, but I think it's tricky because I find that a lot of people just download, like, all the apps regardless of what they're looking for, and they
Mm,
create a profile on all the apps.
right,
And so it doesn't allow apps to have their different cultures around them. Where it's like, "No, this specific app is meant for more of that kind of, like, one night stand, maybe friends with benefits connection, but this app is, like, really meant for finding a more long-term relationship."
right. Yeah, yeah. I don't know, they've definitely got their place, and I don't know anybody who feels super great about it, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the alternative is going out in person, and that is also scary, so
That is scary. I think that that's what I hear from a lot of people. Like, sometimes people come into the store and they're like, "Can you give me advice on dating?" And I'm like, "I don't know that I'm particularly great at it to give you advice on dating?" I'm like,
right.
"You can try the apps, and those have their downfalls, and they work out for some people, or you can go out in person." But what I hear from a lot of people is, like, going out and putting yourself out there in person is scary. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, I feel
dating
like
in 2026 is tricky.
it is, it's super
Yeah.
tricky. It's always gonna be uncomfortable putting yourself
Mhm,
out there in any
mhm.
situation, but
I mean, that vulnerability, though, is required for building a relationship that is a
Right.
more longer term relationship, and I think that's yeah, that's difficult for a lot of people.
For me, what I see to be kind of a key issue for it is when you're dating, if you're going out to find a relationship on the night where you are hungry for a relationship, it's maybe going to lead to a one night stand because of rushed decisions and all of the anxiety of going out and trying to find a connection. If you're just existing out in the world with your friends, having fun and living your life in spaces that are approachable with the demographic of person that you are attracted to. And honestly, one of the things that I was thinking about a while ago is I like to go to coffee shops and I talk. Like I have conversations with my friends at coffee shops and I talk about what we talk about on the podcast a lot. And I want to like make a sign or something that I can put on the table that says, if you're interested in what you hear me talking about, feel free to talk to me. I want to let people know. I want to flag somehow that I'm an approachable person, even though I'm in a public space. That doesn't mean that I am expecting my privacy, which a lot of people are these days. You know, the big old earmuff headphones, sitting at their table, drinking their coffee or whatever, expecting to be left alone. And that's 100% reasonable. But for those of us who are looking to build community and connection, regardless of that, what kind of relationship that is, I want to come up with a flagging method for I am approachable. Feel free to talk to me if what you overhear me talking about is interesting. I think that that should be a thing. I don't know how to do it,
Yeah.
but I think that it should be a thing because that's how you build relationships. That's how you build community. And the more relationships and community you build, the more you have access and potential for getting the kind of romantic relationship that you're after. And then for hookup culture, there's always the apps,
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'm curious if you come up with a method of signaling that to other people. If you're interested in what you hear me talking about, come join the conversation, you
right?
know? Because I think that that's like a social taboo and people like look at you weird if you like, jump into their conversation.
I love it.
Yeah.
I think it's a bold move.
Mhm.
I am a total weirdo. And so if I'm out in public and I hear somebody saying something loud enough for people to overhear it, I almost can't stop myself from being like, hell yeah, or whatever, you know? And in some way, just acknowledging that what they're doing is cool or what they're talking about is cool. But I am really the weirdo when it comes to that. Not so many people do that. I've noticed that in San Francisco a lot where you go to a coffee shop and it's almost quiet and it's eerie. And I think that we can step out and make connections more. And I want people to do that with me, as long
Yeah.
as they're not being creepers.
Yeah.
Because I don't want
Yeah.
creepers. Like, I'm not
Yeah.
interested in being stalked or whatever because my conversational topic arouses you and you think that you can then, like, hook up with me immediately, whatever.
Yeah.
But I am interested in having good conversations and thoughtful experiences. And if what I'm discussing piques your interest, have some academic discourse with me. I'm in. And maybe that could turn into something, but it's not like, I don't know. I just feel like this comes all the way back to the patriarchy and people relating situations where, my God, the number of videos about how random men, it's always men, come up and try to touch them in public spaces just because they're existing there and looking hot drives me crazy. It's not what I'm asking for. What I am asking for is if the topics of my conversation interest you intellectually, feel free to engage with me in discourse. That's the invitation. If that turns into
Yeah.
some sort of relationship, whether that be a friendship or more discourse in the future because we have similar academic interests or whatever, maybe it turns into a hookup because that is on the table if you're cool. But that shouldn't be the expectation. It shouldn't be the presumption. It shouldn't be where you are feeling entitled to get.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like the other, struggle in building relationships. I try to be very open to like when I'm meeting people, like, oh, this could go a variety of ways. Maybe I talked to this person once and never again. Maybe they're a friendship, maybe there's something else.
Sure.
But I think a lot of people sometimes like approach conversations with like a destination in mind for the conversation instead of being open to whatever ends up happening, you
Right.
know? Yeah.
Anyway, that was a fascinating conversation. I think we actually got into some weird stuff,
Yeah.
considering,
Yeah.
and I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me back.
Yeah. It sounds to me like we've got more research to do and more coming back together to do,
Yes. I mean, always more research to do and more
right?
learning to do. So,
Yeah. This is a never-ending podcast.
yeah,
You know, sex and sexuality, identity and expression, gender discourse, relationships.
all the things.
It all just needs to be talked about more. And on that note, this has been Tales from a Sex Store. I'm Hazel here with my guest, Cole. Happy
Happy
orgasms
orgasms.
and mental hugs.
Mental hugs.
Bye.